Hi there, I'm Dr. Rachel Forshaw. I'm Assistant Professor of Economics at Heriot-Watt University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about COVID-19 and its effect on labour markets. I'm going to talk to you about what effects do recessions have in general on labour markets, and then move to talking about what the current crisis has meant for labour markets. In particular, I'll contrast the cases of the US and UK, which are two economies that have a lot of similarities, but have had very different economic policies for this crisis. I'll then move to talk about what we might expect for the future, and finally, how this all relates to your personal decision to undertake a master's degree. So what effects do recessions have in general on labour markets? Here is a very simplistic model of an economy. Each of these dots represents a firm that employs employees, and there are different coloured dots to represent different sectors of the economy. So blue is financial services, yellow is education, green is manufacturing, etc. And we see that these firms interact with one another. These are represented by the grey lines that connect them. So we see that, for example, financial services do a lot of business, have a lot of supply linkages with other financial services firms, but they also supply services to firms in sectors such as manufacturing or education. And in good times, what we expect to see is more dots in this model, more firms coming online and employing employees, and more linkages between these firms. In contrast, in a recession, what we might see is fewer firms, so fewer dots, and importantly, fewer linkages between these firms. And these linkages are really important and they take time to grow. What effects has the COVID-19 crisis had? And let's look at the case of the US versus the UK. So the US and UK have had very different policies to counter the current crisis. In the US, they created a 2.2 trillion rescue aid fund, which is a huge amount of money, into various different policies. One of these was the Paycheck Protection Program, which essentially meant that you could as a firm, take out a loan from the government, that as long as you kept on your employees, the government would forgive that loan at a later stage. The criticism of this policy is that it's not necessarily gone to the firms that need it the most, the ones that are really struggling. And so it's led to more unemployment as these firms actually go out of business. And the reason for this is that firms don't necessarily believe that the government will forgive these loans, and they don't want to take on more debt. In contrast, in the UK, the government has taken a much more direct approach into labour markets, and this is a fairly common policy across Europe, to be more direct in markets. But in particular in the UK, the furlough scheme allows firms to send workers home, ask them not to work, and the government will directly pay them 80% of their current wages. So the big contrast here is that the UK has tried to keep those, if we think about that network graph, keep those linkages intact, essentially suspended animation of the economy. In contrast, the US has let a lot more firms go out of business. And let's see what this has meant for unemployment. Here is a graph of the United States unemployment over time. I've included back to 2000, so it includes the last two recessions for you to compare it to. Looking at the Great Recession of 2008, these grey bars are the recessions, we can see that the unemployment rate went from about 5% to about 10% at its peak. So big increase, doubled the unemployment rate. And then post about 2010, it took a very long time for the unemployment rate to return back to a low level. And we see right at the end of the graph, the data that we're starting to get. We have two data points there of the unemployment rate almost at 15%. This represents, it's a huge amount of unemployment, and it means that we've wiped out all of the jobs growth over the last decade in just a few months. And what's worse is that we know that this figure is an underestimate. The authority, the BLS, that has compiled this data has said that they've made some mistakes. So some economists think that this unemployment rate could be as high as 18, even 20%. In the UK, we don't have unemployment figures yet, or rather, I don't. Perhaps you do, because they come out on the 19th of June. So you can check me against the data. But what we have is the claimant count. We know this will be less than the unemployment rate because it's people that are unemployed and they've decided to claim benefits rather than perhaps waiting it out. The most recent figure has been 5.8%, which it's high, but we've certainly seen it higher if you look at the 90s recession there. And this probably translates to an unemployment rate of around 10%. So we've seen that these different policies can have drastically different implications for the current unemployment rate. But what about the future? There are lots of potential long-term effects that lots of people are doing research into right now. Some of them are the following. So many economists think that there'll be something called a V-shaped recovery, which essentially means the economy goes down and then quickly up in terms of GDP, or how much we're producing in economies. But that, of course, will very much depend on whether we can preserve or grow those linkages between firms that we saw in the beginning. And we know that there's going to be very different effects to different people. So, and there are a lot of trends in labour markets that will be exacerbated by recessions. Some of these are income inequality. We know that the very richest in society are seeing their income grow much more than those at the poorest in society. Another thing to look at will be gender differences. There's some evidence that women are taking a lot of the caring responsibilities during the current crisis for children and elderly people. Will they be able to return to the labour force afterwards? Another huge trend is educational differences, in particular automation of jobs. So we've seen as a long-term trend that the very well-educated, highly skilled individuals are able to thrive in labour markets. In contrast, the low-skilled, low-educated are being replaced by machines. Will these jobs return for them after the crisis, or will they be all done by machines? The key thing to look at for all of these trends is participation. And what I mean by that is attachment to the labour market. Are people actively working, gaining skills, or are they searching for work? Or are they not participating and they're sat at home apart from the labour market, losing their skills over time? The more people that are not participating in these particular groups, they will see the worst outcomes. So how does this all relate to your personal decision to undertake a master's degree? Well, I have to state my bias that I am an educator, and I always think it's an excellent idea to undertake more education. But I'll tell you the research, the evidence behind why I think it's a good idea. There's lots of research that shows that unfortunately graduating in a recession can have negative, long-term and lasting negative career effects. The reason for this is that you're graduating at a time when the unemployment rate is high, and you're competing not only just against other graduates for jobs, but against people that have labour market experience. So being able to delay your entry into the labour market and gain skills at the same time by undertaking a master's degree is a fantastic idea. And even out with recessions, we know there is lots of research that suggests that doing a master's degree leads to higher wages in general. It is, on the whole, a good investment in yourself that tends to pay off. And it's not just about higher wages, it's about the people that you meet, the networks that you can create, the exposure to new ideas and new ways of looking at the world. So that's all I have time for. I hope you've enjoyed my short talk. Thanks for listening, and perhaps see you around the campus in September.